You ever realize too late that the person you stopped was never supposed to be stopped? The red and blue lights pulsed across the quiet street, reflecting off the smooth surface of a black sedan parked just slightly off the curb, its engine still humming low like it had somewhere important to be, somewhere urgent, somewhere far beyond this ordinary stretch of road. But none of that mattered to Officer Daniel Hayes as he stepped out of his patrol car, his boots hitting the pavement with slow, deliberate confidence, the kind that came from years of believing he controlled every situation he walked into, his hand resting near his belt as his eyes locked onto the woman behind the wheel, already forming a judgment before a single word was exchanged, because to him, this wasn't a question, it was a conclusion, and conclusions didn't need evidence, they just needed someone to carry them out. License and registration, he said sharply as the window rolled down, his tone clipped, impatient, as if the night itself had offended him. But the woman, Naomi Carter, didn't flinch, didn't rush, didn't scramble the way he expected. Instead, she moved with a quiet precision, her hands steady, her posture composed, her eyes lifting to meet his for just a brief second. And in that second, there was something he couldn't quite name, something that didn't fit the script he had already written in his head, but he ignored it, because ignoring things was easier than questioning them. "Is there a problem, officer?" she asked, her voice calm, controlled, the kind of calm that didn't come from fear but from knowing exactly where she stood, and somehow that made him tighten his jaw just a little more, because calm wasn't something he associated with compliance. Calm felt like resistance, like defiance, like something that needed to be corrected. "Step out of the vehicle," he said, firmer now, louder, as if volume could re-establish the balance he felt slipping. And for a moment, just a moment, the world seemed to pause, the distant hum of traffic fading, the air holding its breath as Naomi slowly opened the door and stepped out, her movements unhurried, deliberate, like she wasn't reacting to him, but to something else entirely, something unseen. And if you were standing there, watching it unfold, you might have noticed it too. The way her eyes scanned the street for half a second longer than necessary. The way her fingers brushed lightly against the edge of her jacket, as if confirming something, sending something, setting something in motion. But Officer Hayes didn't see that, or maybe he chose not to, because in his mind, this was already over, already decided. Another routine stop, another name he wouldn't remember. "Turn around," he instructed, reaching for his radio as it crackled faintly at his shoulder, a sound so subtle it barely registered. But then it came again, sharper this time, layered voices cutting through the static, urgent, overlapping, and for the first time that night, his confidence hesitated, just slightly, just enough to make him glance down, just enough to miss the way Naomi's expression shifted, not into fear, not into anger, but into something far more dangerous, something quiet, something certain, because while he thought he had just stopped a car on a quiet American street, what he didn't realize, not yet, was that he had just stepped into the middle of something much bigger than himself, something already moving, already watching, already deciding how this moment would end. The radio did not stop after that first crackle. It sharpened, voices stacking over each other with a tone that did not belong to routine traffic chatter. And Officer Daniel Hayes felt it before he understood it, that subtle shift in the air, the kind that made seasoned instincts whisper that something was off. But pride is a loud thing, louder than instinct, and he pressed his thumb against the radio button anyway. "Dispatch, repeat that." His voice controlled but tighter now, while behind him, Naomi Carter stood exactly where he had told her to, hands visible, posture relaxed, as if the situation unfolding was not happening to her but around her, as if she were observing it from a distance only she could see. And if you looked closely, you would notice that her eyes were not on him anymore. They were moving, scanning the edges of the street. The reflections in the windows, the faint glow of headlights approaching from farther down the road. Calculating, always calculating. "Officer Hayes, confirm your location immediately." The voice on the radio cut through again, clearer now, sharper, carrying an urgency that did not match the quiet suburban block they were standing on. And for the first time, he hesitated, just long enough for doubt to slip in. Because dispatch did not sound like this for a simple stop. Dispatch did not repeat itself like that unless something bigger was already in motion. But instead of stepping back, he leaned forward, doubling down the only way he knew how, I asked you to turn around, he said, his tone firmer, trying to regain control, trying to anchor himself in the version of reality he understood, where he gave orders and people followed them, where situations did not shift without his permission. But Naomi did not move right away, not because she was refusing, but because she was choosing the exact moment to respond. And when she finally did, it was slow, deliberate, every motion measured like it mattered, like timing was everything. Because to her, it was, "Officer," she said quietly, her voice steady in a way that did not rise to challenge him, but did not submit either. "You might want to listen to that radio." And there it was again, that feeling, that brief flicker of something he could not quite control. Because people who were supposed to be in her position did not speak. Like that. They did not suggest, they did not redirect, they complied. But she was not complying in the way he expected, she was guiding. And that made something in his chest tighten. "I will handle this," he snapped, almost too quickly, as if cutting her off would cut off the doubt too. But the radio answered for her, louder this time, undeniable. "All units stand down. I repeat, stand down and do not engage." The words hung in the air, heavy, out of place, and for a second, everything slowed. The flashing lights, the distant hum of engines, even his own breathing, because stand down was not a suggestion, it was an order, and not one meant for situations like this, not for a quiet street with one woman and one officer. Unless it was never just that to begin with. And that was when he noticed it, the black SUV approaching from the far end of the block, moving with purpose, not speeding, not rushing, but steady, controlled, like it had all the time in the world because it already knew where it was going. And as it drew closer, another followed behind it, then another, their headlights cutting clean lines through the darkness. And something inside him shifted, something he could not ignore anymore, because whatever this was, it was no longer his scene to control, and Naomi, still standing there, finally turned her head slightly, just enough to look at him again, her expression unchanged, calm, certain, as if she had been waiting for this exact moment all along. The vehicles did not rush, they arrived, one after another, dark silhouettes gliding into position with a precision that did not belong to chance, their engines low, controlled, as if even the sound had been trained to obey. And Officer Daniel Hayes felt the ground beneath his certainty begin to shift in a way he had never experienced before, because this was no longer a moment he could define, no longer a situation he could command. It was something else entirely, something already structured. Long before he stepped out of his patrol car, and as the first SUV came to a stop just 20 feet away, its headlights cutting across the scene and freezing everything in sharp contrast, the door opened slowly. Not with urgency, not with panic, but with authority, and a man stepped out, dressed in a clean, pressed uniform that carried no visible rank to the untrained eye, yet somehow carried more weight than any badge Daniel had ever worn, his posture straight, his movements deliberate, his gaze scanning once, taking in everything, and then settling not on the officer, but on Naomi, as if she were the center of the entire moment, as if everything else was secondary. "Ma'am," the man said, his voice firm but respectful, and that single word landed heavier than anything that had been said so far, because it shifted the balance instantly. It redefined the roles without needing explanation, and Daniel felt it, that quiet collapse of control, the realization creeping in not as a sudden shock, but as a slow, undeniable truth that he had stepped into something far beyond his understanding. "What is going on here?" he demanded. But even as he spoke, the authority in his voice faltered, not completely, but enough to betray the uncertainty he was trying to suppress, because the scene was no longer responding to him. It was responding to her, and Naomi finally moved, just slightly, turning fully now, her shoulders relaxed, her gaze steady, as if this had always been the direction things were meant to go, as if every second leading up to this had been part of a timeline only she could see clearly. "Officer Hayes initiated a stop," she said calmly, her voice even, factual, not accusatory, not emotional, just precise, like someone documenting an event rather than reacting to it, and the man in uniform nodded once, a small acknowledgement that carried more weight than 100 questions, because it was not confusion he showed, it was confirmation, as if what she said aligned perfectly with information he already had. And that was when Daniel noticed the others stepping out of the vehicles behind him, not rushing, not surrounding, just positioning themselves with quiet coordination, each movement intentional, each glance purposeful, creating a perimeter that did not feel aggressive but did feel absolute, like invisible lines being drawn that no one would cross. And his radio crackled again, louder now, almost insistent. "Officer Hayes, you are ordered to disengage immediately." The voice repeated, clearer than before, leaving no room for interpretation. And for a moment, he stood there, caught between two realities, the one he believed he controlled and the one unfolding in front of him. And the gap between them was widening by the second. Disengage from what? He muttered, almost to himself. Because the answer was no longer obvious. Because the situation he thought he understood was no longer the same situation at all. And Naomi took one small step forward, not toward him, but into the space that had opened, her presence quiet yet commanding, her voice low but unmistakably certain. "From an operation that was never yours to interrupt," she said, and there was no anger in her tone, no need for it, because the truth itself was enough. And in that moment, as the lights continued to flash and the night seemed to hold its breath, Daniel Hayes finally understood that he had not been leading this encounter, he had been walking into it. For a moment no one moved, and that silence said more than any command ever could, because it was not the silence of confusion, it was the silence of realization slowly taking shape, and Officer Daniel Hayes felt it pressing in from every direction, not loud, not forceful, but steady, undeniable, like something closing around a moment that could not be undone. His grip loosening just slightly at his side as his eyes moved from one uniform to another, searching for something familiar, something he could anchor himself to, but nothing here belonged to his world anymore. Not the posture, not the discipline, not even the way they looked at Naomi, because they were not evaluating her, they were awaiting her, and that difference was everything. "You need to explain what is happening," he said again, but this time the words came slower, less certain, because the answer he expected no longer existed. And Naomi studied him for a brief second, not with anger, not with satisfaction, but with something far more measured, as if she were deciding how much truth he was ready to hear, or perhaps how much truth he needed to hear. "There is nothing to explain that would make sense from where you are standing," she replied quietly, her voice calm, controlled, carrying the weight of someone who understood the entire board while he had only seen a single square. And that was when the man who had stepped out first moved slightly closer, his presence firm but not intrusive, his eyes shifting briefly toward Hayes, not hostile, not dismissive, just clear. "Officer, I suggest you follow the directive you were given," he said, his tone even, but beneath it was something unmistakable, authority that did not need to raise its voice to be heard. And the radio echoed it again as if on cue. "Disengage immediately." The words now sharper, final, leaving no room for delay, and Hayes swallowed, the weight of it settling in, because for the first time in a long time, he was not being asked, he was being overridden, and that realization did not come with anger. It came with something quieter, something more unsettling, because it forced him to question not just this moment, but the assumptions that had led him here in the first place. And as his hand slowly dropped away from the radio, he looked back at Naomi, really looked this time, not as a suspect, not as a problem to solve, but as a person he had completely misread, and the pieces began to fall into place in a way that made his chest tighten. The calm, the control, the lack of fear, none of it had been defiance. It had been certainty, certainty that she was never in danger, because the situation had never belonged to him. And Naomi could see it in his expression, that shift, that quiet unraveling of certainty, and she stepped forward just enough to close the distance between them, not to confront, not to intimidate, but to make one thing unmistakably clear. "You thought you were managing a situation," she said softly, her words measured, precise, "but you stepped into one that was already in motion long before you arrived." And there was no accusation in her tone, only truth, the kind that did not need emphasis because it carried its own weight. And behind her the vehicles idled. The personnel remained still, everything held in that same controlled pause, waiting, not for escalation, not for conflict, but for alignment, for the moment when reality caught up with perception. And as the flashing lights continued to paint the street in shifting colors, Hayes finally exhaled, the tension in his shoulders easing just slightly, not because the situation was resolved, but because he had finally understood that it was never his to resolve. And in that understanding, something changed, not just in the moment, but in him. The night did not return to normal. It simply shifted into a different kind of control, the kind that did not need raised voices or sudden movements. Just quiet authority settling into place like it had always been there, an officer. Daniel Hayes stood in the middle of it, no longer directing anything, no longer interpreting the scene through his own assumptions, just observing as the structure around him revealed itself piece by piece, the vehicles now positioned with exact spacing, the personnel communicating with subtle nods instead of words, everything operating on a level of coordination he could feel but not fully understand. And Naomi Carter remained at the center of it all, without ever trying to take that position, which somehow made it even more undeniable, because real authority did not need to announce itself. It was recognized. And as one of the uniformed men stepped closer to her, holding a secure tablet angled just enough for her to see, Hayes caught a glimpse of shifting maps, layered data, moving indicators that meant nothing to him, but clearly meant everything to them. And Naomi's eyes moved across the screen with effortless focus, her expression unchanged yet deeply engaged, like someone reviewing a situation already anticipated, already mapped out in her mind long before it appeared in front of her. Status update, she said quietly, her voice calm but carrying an expectation that was immediately met. Perimeter remained stable, primary objective still in motion, no further interruptions, the man replied, his tone precise, professional, and Hayes felt the weight of that last phrase settle in. No further interruptions, not an accusation, not a judgment, just a statement of fact. That placed his earlier actions into a context he could not ignore, because in their world, what he had done was not control, it was interference, and that realization lingered in a way that made him shift his stance slightly, his posture less rigid now, less certain, and Naomi turned her head just enough to acknowledge him again, not as a threat, not even as a problem, but as someone who had stepped into something he did not understand. You followed your instincts, she said, her tone even. Not dismissive, not approving, simply acknowledging the reality of his perspective, but instincts without full information can lead you into places you were never meant to be. And there was no condemnation in her words, which somehow made them land heavier. Because she was not trying to correct him, she was showing him the gap between what he saw and what was actually there. And Hayes let out a slow breath, his eyes briefly lowering before lifting again, the edge in his expression replaced by something quieter, something closer to awareness. I did not know, he said, and for the first time, the statement carried no defensiveness, just truth. And Naomi nodded once, a small gesture that acknowledged that fact without excusing the outcome. Because in her world, knowledge was not optional. It was everything, and the vehicles remained in place, the operation continuing seamlessly around them as if the interruption had already been absorbed, already accounted for, because that was what systems like this were built to do, adapt without breaking. And as the distant sound of another approaching unit blended into the background, Hayes understood something he had not considered before. That control was not about who spoke the loudest or acted the fastest. It was about who saw the full picture, and standing there under the fading flash of his own patrol lights, he realized that for the first time, he had only been seeing a fraction of it. The operation did not pause for him. It adjusted, flowed around his presence like water finding its path, and Naomi Carter continued to move through it with a calm precision that made everything else feel slower, heavier, almost out of sync, as if time itself had a different rhythm in her world. And Officer Daniel Hayes stood just outside of it now, no longer at the center, no longer even a variable, just a witness to something unfolding on a scale he had never considered. And as the tablet screen shifted again in the hands of the officer beside her, new data appeared, lines intersecting, points converging, patterns forming that told a story far beyond a quiet street in a small American neighborhood, a story of movement, of coordination, of decisions made miles away yet affecting this exact moment. And Naomi studied it without hesitation, her eyes scanning, processing, connecting details in a way that made it clear this was not new to her. This was not unexpected. This was her environment. "Adjust the outer perimeter by 30 feet, she said, her voice steady, measured, and the response was immediate, silent confirmations passing between the team as positions shifted subtly, almost imperceptibly, yet with complete alignment, and Hayes felt the distance between his understanding and hers widen even further because to him, this had started as a simple stop, a single interaction, but here it was part of something layered, something strategic, something that did not begin or end with him. And as the flashing lights from his patrol car continued to pulse against the pavement, they now felt out of place, almost intrusive, like a signal from a different world that no longer applied here. And Naomi glanced toward the street beyond the vehicles. Her gaze focused on something unseen, something approaching, and for a brief moment, there was a shift in her expression. Not concern, not urgency, but recognition, like a piece of the plan had just reached its expected point. "We are right on schedule," she said quietly, more to herself than to anyone else. And those words settled into the air with a quiet certainty that left no room for doubt. Because in that moment, it became clear that nothing here was accidental, not the timing, not the positioning, not even the interruption that Hayes had caused. It had all been absorbed, accounted for, and redirected without breaking the flow, and he found himself watching her more closely now, not out of suspicion, but out of a growing realization that everything about her contradicted what he had assumed at the beginning of this night. The calm was not defiance. It was control. The silence was not submission. It was calculation. And the stillness was not uncertainty. It was discipline, the kind built over years of seeing situations most people never would. And as another vehicle slowed in the distance, its headlights cutting softly through the dark, Hayes understood that whatever was about to happen next had been decided long before he ever turned on his lights. And Naomi took a small step forward, aligning herself with the movement of the operation, her presence now fully integrated into it. No longer just the center, but the axis around which everything turned. And without raising her voice, without demanding attention, she spoke again. "Prepare for transition." And the team responded as one, not because they were told to, but because they already knew. And standing there under the fading echo of his own authority, Officer Daniel Hayes realized that he had not just misjudged a person. He had misjudged an entire reality, one where control was not taken, it was earned, and he had just come face to face with someone who had mastered it. The air shifted again, not with noise, not with sudden motion, but with a quiet precision that felt almost invisible unless you knew exactly what to look for. And Naomi Carter did, her eyes narrowing just slightly as the approaching vehicle slowed to a controlled stop at the edge of the formation, its presence acknowledged without a single word spoken, because in this space, communication did not rely on volume. It relied on awareness, and every person there seemed to understand their role. Before it was even spoken aloud, "Position confirmed," one of the officers murmured, his voice low, almost blending into the hum of engines, and Naomi gave the smallest nod, the kind that carried instruction without needing to explain it, because everything was already in motion, everything already aligned, and Officer Daniel Hayes felt himself standing further outside of it now, not physically, but mentally, like he was watching a system operate at a level he had never been trained to recognize, let alone control. And as the new arrival stepped out, carrying a sealed case with careful precision, Hayes noticed the way everyone subtly adjusted, not in reaction, but in coordination, creating a clear path without being told, as if the movement itself had been rehearsed long before this moment. And Naomi stepped forward to meet him, her presence steady, her focus absolute, the world around her narrowing down to the exact point where everything converged. And for a brief second, time seemed to slow again, not dramatically, not noticeably, but enough for the weight of the moment to settle in, because whatever was inside that case, whatever this operation was building toward, it was reaching a critical point, and Hayes could feel it even without understanding it. That quiet tension that came not from chaos, but from precision, from everything falling into place exactly as it was meant to. "Proceed," Naomi said softly, and the word carried more authority than any command he had given that night, because it did not demand action. It confirmed it, and the man opened the case just enough to reveal its Contents to her. Something small, something controlled, something that clearly mattered far beyond its size. And Naomi's eyes held on it for a fraction longer than anything else, not with hesitation, but with confirmation, like the final piece of a plan aligning perfectly with expectation. And she closed her eyes for just a brief moment, not out of doubt, but out of certainty, as if locking the entire sequence into place. "We move now," she said, and instantly the stillness broke, not into chaos, but into motion, every person shifting into position with quiet efficiency, vehicles adjusting, paths opening, the entire scene transforming without losing its control. And Hayes stood there, watching it unfold, realizing that the moment he thought was the center of this night had only been a fraction of something much larger, something that did not pause for misunderstanding, did not bend for assumption. And as Naomi turned slightly, preparing to step into the next phase of whatever this operation truly was, her gaze passed over him one last time, not lingering, not judging, just acknowledging, as if marking the moment for what it was, a point where two different realities had crossed paths for a brief second before continuing on their separate ways. And in that look, Hayes understood something that stayed with him longer than the flashing lights, longer than the radio calls, longer than the night itself. That power was not always visible, not always loud, and sometimes the most dangerous thing a person could do was assume they recognized it when they did not. Movement did not explode outward. It unfolded with intention, like a sequence already written long before anyone on that street realized they were part of it. And Naomi Carter stepped forward without hesitation, her pace steady, her focus locked ahead as the vehicles adjusted in perfect synchronization, creating a corridor that had not existed seconds ago, and yet now felt inevitable, as if the street itself had reshaped to accommodate what was happening. And the personnel around her did not rush to lead, they aligned to follow, their positions shifting with quiet precision, every step calculated, every glance purposeful. And Officer Daniel Hayes remained where he was, no longer trying to insert himself, no longer reaching for control, because something inside him had already shifted beyond that point, something that told him this was not a moment to act, but a moment to understand, even if understanding came too late to change anything. And as Naomi moved past him, close enough that he could hear the faint rhythm of her breath, steady and controlled, he noticed something he had missed before, not just her calm, but the discipline behind it, the kind built over years of making decisions where hesitation was not an option, where clarity determined outcomes far beyond a single street. And for the first time, he did not see her as someone in his way. He saw her as someone operating on a level he had never been trained to recognize. "Maintain sequence," she said quietly as she passed, and the words moved through the team like a current, subtle but immediate, each member adjusting without breaking stride. And the vehicle at the center of the formation began to move, slowly at first, then with a smooth acceleration that carried the entire operation forward, not hurried, not delayed, just exactly on time. And the flashing lights from Hayes' patrol car now felt distant, disconnected from the reality unfolding just a few feet away, as if they belonged to a different moment entirely. And he turned slightly, watching as the formation advanced, the vehicles merging back into the road. With seamless coordination, their presence fading into the night not by disappearing, but by becoming part of something larger, something that extended far beyond what he could see. And for a brief second, he considered stepping forward, saying something, asking something, but the thought dissolved before it could take shape, because he already knew there was nothing he could say that would fit into what had just happened, nothing that would bridge the gap between what he thought this was and what it truly had been. And Naomi did not look back, not out of indifference, but because she did not need to. The moment had already been defined, the lesson already set. And as the last vehicle passed, the street began to return to its quiet state, the hum of engines fading, the coordinated movement dissolving into the distance, leaving behind nothing but the faint echo of something far more complex than it appeared. And Hayes stood there, the weight of it settling in, not as regret, not as anger, but as awareness, the kind that lingers long after the moment is gone. And in that stillness, under the fading glow of his own lights, he realized that what had just happened would never be written in his report the way it truly occurred, Because some things could not be captured in simple terms, some things existed beyond the limits of explanation. And as he finally reached to turn off the flashing lights, the street went dark again, returning to its ordinary appearance, but nothing about it felt ordinary anymore. Not after he had seen what real control looked like when it did not need to announce itself. The street settled into silence, but it was not the same silence as before. It carried something heavier now, something that lingered in the air like a question that had already been answered but not yet understood. And Officer Daniel Hayes remained beside his patrol car, his hand resting lightly on the roof as if grounding himself in something familiar, something that still made sense. Because everything else about the night had shifted beyond recognition, and the absence of the vehicles, the absence of Naomi Carter, somehow felt louder than their presence had been, as if the space they left behind still held the imprint of what had just unfolded. And for a long moment, he did not move, did not speak, did not reach for the radio again, because there was nothing left to report that would capture the truth of it, nothing that would translate what he had seen into the language of routine. And yet the radio came to life anyway, softer now, controlled. Officer Hayes, confirm status. The voice asked, no longer urgent, no longer overlapping, just steady, waiting, and he hesitated before responding, not because he did not hear it, but because he was searching for the right words, words that no longer felt as simple as they once had. Situation resolved, he finally said, his voice lower than before, more measured, because that was the closest thing to the truth he could offer without unraveling everything else that came with it. And there was a brief pause on the other end, as if the response was being processed, filed, categorized into something that fit the system, even if the reality itself did not. Copy that, the voice replied, and just like that, the moment was reduced to a line of communication, a record that would never reflect what it had actually been. And Hayes lowered the radio slowly, his eyes drifting back to the road where the convoy had disappeared. And for the first time, he allowed himself to think about it differently, not as an interruption, not as a mistake, but as something that had exposed a gap in the way he saw the world, a gap he had never questioned before, because it had always worked in his favor, always aligned with his expectations, until it did not. And he replayed the moment in his mind, the first command, the first assumption, the way he had already decided what he was looking at before he even understood it. And now, standing in the quiet aftermath, that certainty felt distant, almost unfamiliar, replaced by something quieter, something more aware, and he exhaled slowly, the tension leaving his shoulders as he stepped back from the car, the flashing lights now turned off, the street returning to its normal rhythm. Passing cars in the distance, a porch light flickering on somewhere down the block, life continuing as if nothing had happened, and yet everything had, because some moments did not leave visible marks. They left perspective, and as Hayes finally moved to get back into his vehicle, he paused for just a second longer, his gaze fixed on the empty road ahead. And in that stillness, one thought settled in with a clarity he could not ignore, that the most dangerous mistakes were not the ones made in chaos. They were the ones made in certainty, when you believed you already knew what you were looking at. And as he closed the door and started the engine, the quiet hum filling the space around him, he understood that this night would not follow him because of what happened, but because of what it revealed, that sometimes the line between authority and assumption was thinner than it appeared, and crossing it did not make you more powerful. It only showed you how little you actually saw. The engine hummed quietly beneath him as Officer Daniel Hayes pulled away from the curb, the tires rolling slowly over the same stretch of asphalt that had just moments ago held something far beyond a routine stop. And yet now it looked exactly the same, ordinary, almost forgettable, as if the night itself had decided to erase any trace of what had happened. But the memory did not fade with it. It stayed sharp, precise, replaying in his mind with a clarity that made it impossible to ignore. Every word, every look, every moment where he had believed he was in control. And as he drove down the block at a steady 30 miles per hour, the glow of streetlights passing rhythmically over the windshield, he found himself gripping the wheel a little tighter than usual, not out of tension, but out of thought, because something about that encounter had shifted the way he processed everything that came after. And when his radio crackled again, softer this time, it did not startle him. It grounded him. All units returned to standard patrol. The voice instructed, calm, routine, the kind of message he had heard 100 times before, and yet now it felt different, not because the words had changed, but because he had, and he pressed the button, responding with a simple copy, his voice steady, controlled, but carrying something new beneath it, something quieter, more deliberate. And as he continued driving, the city around him slowly came back into focus, a couple walking along the sidewalk, a car pulling out of a driveway, the normal rhythm of life continuing without interruption, without awareness of what had just passed through it. And that realization lingered, because it reminded him how often things happened just outside the view of those not looking for them, how much of the world operated on layers he had never been trained to see. And his mind drifted back to Naomi Carter, not as the figure standing under flashing lights, but as the presence that had shifted an entire operation without raising her voice, without needing to assert herself in the way he had always believed authority worked. And that contrast stayed with him, because it challenged something deeper than just a single moment. It challenged the way he had defined control, the way he had assumed it functioned. And as he turned onto the main road, merging smoothly into the flow of traffic, he realized that what unsettled him was not that he had been wrong. It was how easily he had been certain, how quickly he had filled in the gaps with assumptions that felt solid until they were not. And the more he thought about it, the more he understood that the situation had never escalated, not because of anything he had done, but because of everything she had chosen not to do, the restraint, the awareness, the discipline to let the moment unfold exactly as it needed to. And that realization carried a weight he could not shake, because it reframed the entire encounter, not as a confrontation, but as a lesson, one he had not expected, one he had not asked for, but one that had been delivered with a precision he could not ignore. And as the miles stretched ahead of him, the city lights blending into a steady glow, he found himself driving a little slower, not out of caution, but out of thought, because for the first time in a long time, he was not just reacting to the road in front of him, he was reconsidering the way he saw it. And in that quiet shift, something changed, not loudly, not dramatically, but enough to matter, enough to stay with him long after the night was over. The city did not slow down for reflection. It kept moving, steady and indifferent. But inside the patrol car, Officer Daniel Hayes felt the weight of something that refused to move on as easily, something that lingered beneath every passing streetlight, every quiet intersection, every routine glance in his mirrors, because the night had changed more than just a moment. It had shifted the way he interpreted everything that followed. And as he drove past familiar blocks, places he had patrolled countless times before, they no longer felt as simple as they once had, no longer defined by quick judgments and immediate conclusions, but layered, complex, carrying possibilities he had never considered before. And when he slowed at a red light, the glow reflecting across the dashboard, he caught his own reflection faintly in the glass, his expression calmer than before, but deeper, more aware, like someone who had seen something they could not unsee. And the silence in the car felt different now, not empty, but thoughtful, filled with the quiet replay of a moment that refused to fade. Naomi Carter, standing under those flashing lights, not reacting, not resisting, just waiting, knowing something he did not, and that knowing had changed everything. And as the light turned green and he eased forward, his mind shifted from the moment itself to what it meant, not just for that night, but for every decision that came after, because the realization was not just that he had been wrong, it was how easily he had been sure, how quickly he had acted without questioning what he could not see. And that thought settled in deeper with every mile, reshaping something fundamental in the way he approached the road ahead. And when another call came through the radio, a minor report just a few blocks away, he responded without hesitation. But this time, there was a pause in his process, not a delay, but a space. A moment where he allowed for the possibility that what he was about to encounter might not be exactly what it appeared to be. And that small shift, almost invisible from the outside, changed everything about how he stepped into the next situation, not with less confidence, but with more awareness, more intention. And as he pulled up to the location, observing before acting, listening before deciding, he realized that control was not about asserting authority first. It was about understanding what stood in front of you before you defined it. And that lesson carried more weight than any training he had gone through, because it had not been taught. It had been experienced, and experiences had a way of staying with you long after the moment passed. And as the night continued, call after call, street after street, the shift remained, subtle but constant, shaping his choices, guiding his instincts in a way that felt unfamiliar at first, but steadily more grounded. And somewhere in the back of his mind, the image of Naomi Carter remained, not as a reminder of a mistake, but as a marker, a point where one way of seeing the world had ended and another had begun. And he understood now that some encounters did not just pass through your life. They redefined the way you moved through it, quietly, completely, without ever needing to return. The hours passed, but the shift did not fade. It settled deeper, shaping each decision with a quiet persistence that Officer Daniel Hayes could not ignore. And by the time the night began to thin into early morning, the streets carrying that soft, empty stillness that comes just before the city wakes, he found himself parked at the edge of a quiet overlook, engine idling low, the horizon just beginning to hint at light. And for a moment, he did nothing, just sat there, hands resting loosely on the wheel, eyes fixed ahead, not on anything specific, but on everything that had led him to this point. Because the night had not been about one moment. It had been about what that moment revealed. And as he replayed it again, not out of confusion, but out of clarity, he saw it differently now. Not as a disruption, not as something that had gone wrong, but as something that had been necessary. Something that had exposed a blind spot he had carried without ever realizing it was there. And that realization did not come with defensiveness anymore. It came with acceptance. Because understanding required letting go of the certainty that once felt unshakable. And as the faint glow of morning stretched across the skyline, he thought about the difference between reacting and observing, between assuming and understanding, and how easily those lines could blur when you believed you already knew what you were seeing. And Naomi Carter's presence remained clear in his mind, not just what she had said, but what she had not said, the restraint, the discipline, the control that did not rely on force, but on awareness. And that contrast stayed with him, because it showed him a version of authority that did not need to prove itself. It simply existed, undeniable, steady. And as he reached over to lower the radio volume slightly, letting the quiet settle around him, he realized that the most significant part of the night had not been the operation, not the vehicles, not even the moment of realization. It had been the shift that followed. The way it carried into everything else, the way it changed how he approached even the simplest decisions. And that was something no report would ever capture, something no line of text could explain. Because it was not visible, it was internal. And as he finally placed the car into drive again, pulling back onto the empty road, the early morning air cool against the windshield, he understood that some lessons did not end when the moment was over. They continued, shaping the way you moved forward, influencing choices you had not even made yet. And that thought stayed with him as the city slowly came back to life around him. Lights flickering on, cars beginning to move, the world returning to its rhythm. And yet for him, the rhythm had changed, not dramatically, not in a way anyone else would notice, but enough to matter, enough to remind him that what you see is not always what is there, and what you assume can shape everything that follows. And as the sun finally broke over the horizon, casting a soft light across the road ahead, he did not feel like he was returning to the same routine. He felt like he was stepping into it with a different understanding, one that would stay long. After the memory of the night itself began to fade, morning did not arrive with a dramatic shift. It came quietly, steadily, like everything else that truly mattered. And as the first light stretched across the city, Officer Daniel Hayes continued down the road, the engine steady, the world around him waking up in familiar ways. And yet nothing felt entirely the same, not because the streets had changed, but because he had. And the difference was subtle, almost invisible from the outside, but undeniable within, shaping the way he looked at every passing car, every pedestrian, every moment that once would have been reduced to quick judgment and immediate action, and now held a space, a pause, a question before the answer. And he realized that was the true impact of the night, not the operation, not the convoy, not even the realization itself, but the shift in how he would move forward from it. Because some lessons did not demand attention. They simply stayed, influencing quietly, guiding without force. and as he slowed at another intersection, watching the light change from red to green, he thought about the difference between control and understanding, and how easily one could be mistaken for the other, because control felt immediate, visible, something you could assert, but understanding required patience, awareness, the willingness to see beyond what was directly in front of you. And Naomi Carter had embodied that difference without ever needing to explain it, without raising her voice, without correcting him directly. She had simply allowed the truth of the situation to unfold, and in doing so, revealed more than any confrontation ever could, and that realization stayed with him as he continued his patrol. The routine no longer just a series of actions, but a series of choices, each one shaped by a deeper awareness of what might exist beyond the surface. And somewhere in the back of his mind, one thought settled in with quiet clarity, that authority was not defined by the power to act, but by the discipline to understand before acting, and that line, once crossed without hesitation, now stood clearly in front of him, not as a barrier, but as a reminder. And as the city fully came to life, the noise rising, the streets filling, the rhythm returning to what it had always been, Hayes did not feel like he was stepping back into the same role he had held the night before. He felt like he was carrying something new into it, something that would not show up in reports or records, but would shape every decision moving forward. And in that quiet understanding, the night found its true ending, not in the moment it happened, but in the way it continued, because he thought he had been the one enforcing the law. But that night, he learned that the law was guided by something far deeper than authority, something that could not be seen until it was understood. And sometimes, the most powerful force was not the one that stopped you, but the one that showed you how little you had seen before.